Someone buys a new phone, barely uses it, keeps it mostly in a drawer as a backup, and checks the battery health a year later expecting it to still read close to 100%. Instead, it reads 89%, roughly the same degradation as a friend's phone that gets used constantly every single day. Both phones experienced wildly different amounts of actual use, yet ended up with strikingly similar battery health numbers. This isn't a manufacturing defect, and it isn't a sign that the barely used phone was secretly being used more than its owner realized. It's a direct consequence of how lithium-ion battery chemistry actually degrades, a process that has surprisingly little to do with how often someone taps their screen and a lot more to do with time, temperature, and the battery simply sitting at certain charge levels. It's a genuinely counterintuitive thing to learn, that the phone treated most gently, the one deliberately spared from daily wear and tear, can end up in nearly the same condition as the one used relentlessly, simply because both of them were, in a chemical sense, aging the entire time regardless of what either owner actually did with them. Battery health gets talked about publicly as if it primarily tracks usage, the number of times someone charges their phone, how many apps run in the background, how bright the screen stays. And usage patterns do matter to some degree. But according to research published by battery chemistry researchers and organizations like the Battery University and various academic material science labs, a substantial share of lithium-ion battery degradation happens through chemical processes that continue regardless of whether the device is actively being used at all. Meaning a phone sitting untouched in a drawer can lose meaningful battery capacity over the exact same calendar period as a phone used heavily every day, simply because both batteries are experiencing the same underlying chemical aging process in parallel with, not primarily because of, active use. This distinction matters for anyone trying to protect a battery's long-term health, since it means the habits most people focus on, closing background apps, dimming the screen, avoiding heavy games, address a relatively small slice of the total degradation picture compared to two factors that rarely make it into casual battery care advice at all: how full the battery sits, and how warm it stays. Let's start with the basic mechanics of what actually happens inside a lithium-ion battery as it ages, because the degradation mechanism is fundamentally chemical rather than purely mechanical or usage-based. Every charge and discharge cycle causes lithium ions to move back and forth between the battery's two electrodes, and with each cycle, a small amount of usable lithium gets permanently trapped inside reactions, unable to participate in future cycles, gradually reducing the battery's total capacity. The technical process works like this. A layer called the solid electrolyte interface forms on the negative electrode surface as the battery operates. And this layer, while necessary for the battery to function safely at all, slowly thickens over time through an ongoing chemical reaction that continues even during periods when the phone isn't being actively charged or discharged, simply because the battery's internal chemistry doesn't fully pause just because the device sitting on top of it isn't in use. This is where an invisible aging mechanism takes over, one that most phone owners never see explained anywhere in a product manual. Calendar aging, meaning degradation that occurs purely as a function of elapsed time rather than charge cycles, happens because the chemical reactions inside a lithium-ion battery are temperature and voltage dependent, not activity dependent. A battery stored at a high state of charge, close to 100%, experiences these background chemical reactions at a meaningfully faster rate than the same battery stored at a lower charge level, because higher voltage across the battery's internal components accelerates the same side reactions that gradually consume usable lithium. This means a phone left fully charged and in use in a drawer for months can, in specific circumstances, degrade at a rate surprisingly close to a phone that gets charged and discharged actively every day, especially if that actively used phone spends much of its time at a more moderate, less stressful charge level rather than sitting pinned at 100%. There's a related invisible mechanism tied to temperature specifically, one that compounds calendar aging significantly. The same chemical reactions driving calendar aging accelerate substantially at higher temperatures, meaning a phone stored in a hot car, a sunny windowsill, or even just a warm room for extended periods can experience meaningfully faster battery degradation than an identical phone stored in a cool, temperature-controlled environment, regardless of how much either phone gets used. Battery manufacturers and researchers commonly reference a rough rule that a lithium-ion battery's aging rate can roughly double for every increase of about 18 degrees Fahrenheit in storage temperature, which means a phone kept in a consistently warm environment, even one that's rarely used, can degrade noticeably faster than a heavily used phone kept in cooler conditions, making storage temperature a more significant factor for many owners than actual screen-on time. Two real-world patterns make this concrete. Battery testing organizations that track long-term degradation across large samples of devices have consistently found that phones kept in low-use, high state of charge storage conditions, exactly the scenario of a backup phone left plugged in and fully charged in a drawer, show measurable capacity loss over a year that can approach or sometimes match phones used constantly. Specifically because the backup phone spent most of its life sitting at a high, chemically stressful charge level and cycling through a range of more moderate states. A second pattern shows up in how manufacturers have responded to this research directly. Several major phone makers have introduced optimized charging features specifically designed to delay a device from reaching 100% charge until shortly before a person typically wakes up or unplugs their phone. A feature built entirely around managing calendar aging and high-voltage stress rather than managing usage-based cycle counts, which tells you something about which factor manufacturers themselves consider the bigger long-term threat to battery health. This challenges the common assumption that battery health is primarily a report card on how intensively someone uses their device, with heavy users expected to see faster decline and light users expected to see their battery stay pristine simply through lack of use. In reality, a meaningful share of battery degradation happens on a chemical clock that runs largely independent of actual usage, driven far more by how full the battery sits and how warm its environment stays than by how many times someone unlocks their screen in a given day. The friction point isn't that usage doesn't matter at all. Extreme fast charging and deep full discharge cycles genuinely do add additional stress. It's that the popular mental model of less use equals better battery health oversimplifies a process where storage conditions can matter just as much, sometimes more, than actual activity. Zoom out. And this same resource degrades from existing, not just from being used. Pattern shows up in other physical systems people commonly misjudge. Tires lose structural integrity from age and environmental exposure even when a car sits parked and unused for years, which is why tire manufacturers recommend replacement based on age in addition to tread wear. Perishable medications and certain chemical products have expiration dates driven by molecular breakdown processes that continue on an unopened shelf regardless of whether the product ever gets used, meaning an unused bottle can expire on essentially the same timeline as one used regularly. In every one of these systems, the assumption that inactivity equals preservation turns out to be only partially true, because the underlying material is often undergoing its own independent aging process that doesn't pause simply because a human being isn't actively interacting with it. So the next time a barely used phone shows unexpectedly significant battery wear, it's worth remembering what that number actually represents. It probably isn't a sign of a defective battery or secretly heavier used than assumed. It's more likely the visible result of a chemical aging process that was quietly running the entire time that phone sat in a drawer, shaped far more by how fully charged it stayed and how warm its storage environment happened to be than by anything resembling how often it was actually picked up and used.